Who let this nurse into surgery? The surgeon laughed. Several residents laughed with him. A few nurses looked away uncomfortably, and the young woman standing beside the operating table simply continued working. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even look offended, which somehow made the laughter worse, because everyone assumed she was embarrassed. The truth was much stranger. She simply didn't care. Her name was Sarah Mitchell, 29 years old. Recently transferred to St. Gabriel Medical Center. Officially, she was an ICU nurse. Unofficially, almost nobody knew anything about her, only that she'd come from a military hospital on the West Coast. And that she never talked about herself. Ever. Most people liked Sarah immediately. Patients loved her. Families trusted her. Veteran patients especially seemed drawn to her calm presence, but some doctors weren't impressed, especially Dr. Michael Reynolds, chief surgeon, brilliant, respected, and unfortunately, arrogant. Dr. Reynolds believed hospitals worked best when everyone stayed in their lane. Doctors diagnosed, doctors operated, doctors made decisions, nurses followed instructions. Simple, at least in his mind. The conflict started during a trauma surgery on a Thursday evening. A car accident victim had arrived in critical condition, internal bleeding, multiple fractures, severe blood loss. The operating room was tense. Everyone moved quickly, everyone except Dr. Reynolds, who appeared irritated because Sarah had quietly pointed out something. Dr. Reynolds barely looked up. What? The blood pressure trend doesn't match the scan. Silence. The surgeon frowned. What are you talking about? Sarah glanced at the monitor, then back at the patient. He's bleeding somewhere else. The room became quiet. Dr. Reynolds laughed. Actually laughed. Thank you, nurse. The tone made several residents smirk. But I'll handle the diagnosis. Sarah simply nodded. Understood. 20 minutes later, the patient crashed. Hard. Blood pressure collapsed. Heart rate spiked. Alarms exploded throughout the operating room. Suddenly, everyone started moving faster. Reynolds searched desperately for the source, then froze, because Sarah had been right. There was a second internal bleed, exactly where she suspected. The surgeon managed to save the patient, but the moment stuck with him. Not because Sarah was correct, because she remained humble afterward. No smugness, no "I told you so," nothing. For some reason that irritated him even more. Over the next several weeks, strange things kept happening. Sarah noticed complications before anyone else, predicted emergencies, recognized symptoms others missed, calmed panicked families, and somehow remained impossibly composed, even during disasters. One resident finally asked, "Where did you train?" Sarah smiled politely. "A few different places." That was all she said. Always. The mystery only grew. Then came the night everything changed. Just after midnight, an ambulance screamed into the emergency entrance, followed by another, then another, then another. The ER immediately went into crisis mode. Doctors rushed downstairs. Nurses sprinted between rooms. Administrators started making calls because the patients weren't ordinary civilians. They were military, elite military, and badly injured. The first man through the doors had suffered severe chest trauma. The second had multiple gunshot wounds. The third arrived unconscious. The fourth was barely breathing. Nobody understood what happened, only that something had gone terribly wrong during a classified operation. Within minutes, the hospital entered emergency lockdown procedures. Security appeared. Government vehicles arrived. Military personnel flooded the building, and suddenly, Sarah stopped looking like an ordinary nurse. The moment she saw the patients, everything about her changed. Her posture, her voice, her eyes. Room 3 now. The command snapped through the ER. People moved instantly, not because they recognized her authority, because somehow she sounded impossible to ignore. Blood ready. Trauma cart. Move. Doctors actually obeyed before realizing what they'd done. Dr. Reynolds noticed immediately and frowned, because for the first time since meeting Sarah, she looked less like a nurse and more like someone taking command. Then, one of the wounded operators regained consciousness briefly, just briefly, long enough to see Sarah. The man's eyes widened. Recognition, shock, relief. His bloody hand grabbed her wrist hard, and despite the pain, the wounded operator managed to whisper four words that made Sarah's face go pale. "Ma'am, you're here." The room froze, because elite military operators rarely called nurses ma'am, and suddenly everyone realized nobody actually knew who Sarah Mitchell was. The emergency room became completely silent. "Ma'am, you're here." The wounded operator's voice was weak, barely audible, yet every person nearby heard it. Every doctor, every nurse, every medic. Sarah immediately leaned closer. "Easy." The operator nodded slightly. Relief flooded his face. Real relief. The kind soldiers felt when someone they trusted finally arrived. Then he lost consciousness again. The room exploded back into motion. Doctors resumed treatment. Machines beeped. Orders flew. Stretchers rolled. But one question lingered in everyone's mind. Why did an elite operator call a nurse ma'am? Dr. Reynolds noticed it too. And he didn't like mysteries, especially mysteries involving people who worked for him. The injured operators were rushed into surgery and intensive care. The entire hospital shifted into crisis mode. Additional staff were called in. Operating rooms opened. Security increased. Military police appeared in hallways. By 3 a.m, St. Gabriel looked less like a hospital and more like a military installation. Sarah worked non-stop. 12 straight hours. No breaks, no complaints. Moving from patient to patient, checking medications, reviewing charts, giving instructions. Several doctors noticed something strange. Whenever Sarah entered a room containing one of the wounded operators, the atmosphere changed. The operators trusted her immediately. Completely. Without hesitation. One severely injured man refused treatment until she spoke to him. Another calmed down the moment she arrived. A third repeatedly asked, "Where's Sarah?" before allowing procedures. Nobody understood why, especially Dr. Reynolds. By noon, he finally confronted her. "What exactly is going on?" Sarah looked up from a chart. "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean." His voice lowered. "Who are these people?" Silence. "Military personnel. Don't play games." The surgeon folded his arms. "Why do they know you?" Sarah stared at him calmly, then returned to her paperwork. "Focus on your patients." The answer infuriated him. For the first time, Dr. Reynolds felt like he was the one being kept out of the loop, and he hated it. That evening, another convoy arrived. Black SUVs, military vehicles, armed escorts. Hospital staff watched through windows, whispering, speculating, wondering. Then the vehicles stopped, and several men stepped out. Every single one looked dangerous, not because of weapons, not because of uniforms, because of the way they carried themselves. Calm, focused, controlled, military, elite, military. The group entered the hospital. Security immediately stepped aside. Not because they were ordered to, because these men clearly weren't ordinary visitors. The leader approached the reception desk. "Sarah Mitchell." The receptionist blinked. "What about her? We need to see her." The request spread through the hospital within minutes. Doctors talked. Nurses talked. Administrators talked. Everyone talked. Because now the mystery had grown even bigger. Who exactly was Sarah Mitchell? The answer arrived unexpectedly. One of the wounded operators suffered complications, severe complications. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Doctors rushed into the ICU. Machines screamed alarms. The patient began crashing. Dr. Reynolds immediately took control. "Let's move." The room filled with staff, everyone working desperately, everyone except Sarah, because Sarah wasn't rushing. She was watching, thinking, analyzing. Then she suddenly stepped forward. "Stop." The room froze. Dr. Reynolds stared. "What?" "Stop." The surgeon looked furious. "Excuse me." Sarah pointed toward the monitor, then toward the patient. "He isn't crashing because of the injuries." Silence. "He's reacting to the medication." Several doctors frowned. Dr. Reynolds shook his head. "Impossible." Sarah didn't move. Check his allergy file. The surgeon looked annoyed. There's no time. There is if you want him alive. The room went silent, because Sarah's tone had changed. Completely. Gone was the quiet nurse. Gone was the polite employee. Now she sounded like someone used to giving orders, someone used to people obeying. Dr. Reynolds reluctantly reviewed the chart, then froze. The allergy information had been entered incorrectly. Sarah was right, again. Within minutes, the medication was changed. The patient's condition stabilized. The alarms stopped. The crisis ended. Nobody spoke, because everybody knew exactly what almost happened. A man nearly died, and Sarah caught it. Dr. Reynolds stared at her. Long silence, then quietly asked, "Who are you?" Sarah looked toward the ICU window, toward the parking lot outside, toward the black SUVs waiting below, for the first time all day. She looked uncomfortable. Then one of the nurses gasped. Everyone turned. A dozen men had just entered the ICU. Not soldiers, not officers, SEALs. And the moment they saw Sarah, every single one stopped walking. Then, without a word, they stood at attention. The entire ICU froze. The ICU became so quiet that people could hear the monitors. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Because 12 Navy SEALs had just entered the room, and every single one of them stood at attention for a nurse. Doctors stared. Nurses stared. Hospital administrators stared. Even Dr. Reynolds looked completely stunned. Then the senior SEAL stepped forward. A tall man with scars running across his jaw, the kind of face that looked carved from stone. He stopped directly in front of Sarah and saluted. A perfect military salute. Every other operator followed immediately. Sarah looked embarrassed, actually embarrassed. "Guys," the senior operator shook his head. "No, ma'am." The room froze again. "Ma'am." Not nurse, not Sarah. Ma'am. The senior SEAL lowered his salute. "We heard what happened," Sarah sighed. "There's no need for this." The operator smiled slightly. "With respect, there is." Dr. Reynolds couldn't take it anymore. "What is going on?" The words escaped before he could stop them. Every eye turned toward him. The senior SEAL studied the surgeon, then looked back at Sarah, almost asking permission. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then nodded once. The operator turned back toward the room. "What do you people know about her?" Silence. Nobody answered, because nobody knew anything. The SEAL laughed softly. "Figures." Then he pointed towards Sarah. "This woman trained some of the best operators in the military." The room froze. "Before she became a nurse." Long pause. "She spent nearly 10 years attached to naval special warfare." Confused faces filled the ICU. One resident frowned. "Attached doing what?" The senior operator smiled. "A lot of things." Then his expression turned serious. But mostly." He looked directly at Sarah. "She taught us how to stay alive." The room went silent. Dr. Reynolds stared. "No." The operator nodded. "Yes." Another SEAL stepped forward. His arm remained in a sling from surgery. "This woman saved my life twice." A third operator spoke. "Mine too." Then another. "And mine." One after another. The stories started coming. Not battlefield stories. Training stories. Medical emergencies. Combat casualties. Evacuations. Life or death situations. And somehow Sarah appeared in every single one. The doctors looked increasingly confused. Because none of this made sense. Why would someone with that background become an ordinary ICU nurse? Dr. Reynolds finally asked the question. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Sarah smiled sadly. "Because I came here to be a nurse." Silence. Not a story. The answer somehow made everyone feel smaller, especially Reynolds, because he remembered every joke, every sarcastic comment, every dismissive laugh, and suddenly they sounded pathetic. The senior SEAL wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket, then placed something on a nearby table. A coin, heavy, metal, worn, military challenge coin. Then another SEAL placed one down, and another, and another. Soon a pile formed. Doctors watched in confusion. One nurse whispered, "What are those?" The senior operator smiled. "Respect." He pointed toward the growing pile. "Every one of those coins was earned." Silence. "And every one of us owes her." Sarah looked uncomfortable again. "Stop." The operator ignored her. Then he looked directly at Dr. Reynolds. "Yesterday you saw a nurse." Long pause. "We see the woman who brought wounded men home." The surgeon felt his face burn, because he knew exactly what the operator meant. He remembered laughing. Who let this nurse into surgery? The words suddenly sounded much worse. Then something unexpected happened. One of the wounded operators motioned towards Sarah. Weakly, painfully. "Tell them." Sarah immediately shook her head. "No." The SEALs smiled. "Tell them." The room watched carefully, because clearly there was one more piece of the story. One more secret. And judging by Sarah's expression, it was the one she wanted hidden most. The ICU remained silent. Every person in the room stared at Sarah. Doctors, nurses, patients, SEAL operators, everyone waiting, everyone curious. The wounded operator looked at her again. "Tell them." Sarah shook her head. "No." The operator smiled weakly. "They deserve to know." Another SEAL nodded. "So do we." Sarah sighed heavily. Clearly she hated attention. Clearly she wanted this conversation to end. But judging from the room, that wasn't happening. Not anymore. Dr. Reynolds finally spoke. "What aren't we being told?" Long silence followed. Then Sarah looked toward the floor and quietly answered, 8 years ago there was an operation." The room became still. "I was attached to a training and medical support unit." She paused. "It went bad." The SEALs exchanged glances. The memory clearly wasn't pleasant. Sarah continued. "Very bad." Another pause. "We lost communication." The ICU remained silent. The team was trapped. Several doctors listened carefully now, because they realized they weren't hearing a military story. They were hearing something personal, something painful. Sarah looked toward the operators, then continued. The extraction helicopter couldn't land. Silence. The situation was collapsing. One of the wounded SEALs lowered his eyes, as if he'd relived this memory 1,000 times. Sarah spoke softly. "They were told help wasn't coming." The room froze, because everyone understood what that meant. Then one of the operators interrupted. "They forgot one detail." Sarah immediately shook her head, but he ignored her. The SEAL looked directly at the room. "She went anyway." Several people blinked. "What?" The operator nodded. Everyone else was pulling back. Silence. She moved forward. Another pause. Toward the gunfire. The room became completely still. Dr. Reynolds stared, unable to process it. Sarah looked uncomfortable. The operator continued. 3 of us were wounded." He pointed toward himself. One couldn't walk, then toward another operator. One was unconscious, then toward the third. And one was bleeding out. Nobody spoke. The SEAL smiled softly. Sarah refused to leave. The surgeon looked stunned. "She's a nurse." The operator nodded. "Exactly." Silence. "She wasn't supposed to be there." Another pause. "But she was." Sarah closed her eyes, clearly wishing the story would stop. It didn't. The operator continued. "She stabilized all 3 casualties." The room listened carefully. "Under fire." Another pause. "Then helped get us out." Dr. Reynolds couldn't believe what he was hearing. For weeks he had treated Sarah like an inexperienced nurse. For weeks he had laughed at her, dismissed her, ignored her. Meanwhile, she had done things most people couldn't imagine. Things most people would never survive. The surgeon felt sick, not because of the story, because of himself. One of the older nurses quietly asked, "Why leave all that behind?" Sarah smiled sadly, a very small smile, then answered, "Because I got tired of watching people die." Silence. "I wanted to help people before they reached that point." The answer hit the room hard, because it wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Sarah wasn't chasing recognition. She wasn't hiding a secret career. She simply wanted to save lives in a hospital instead of a battlefield. The senior SEAL stepped forward, then pulled a small folded photograph from his wallet. He handed it to Dr. Reynolds. The surgeon looked down and froze. The photo showed a younger Sarah, covered in dirt, covered in blood, standing beside several exhausted operators. All smiling, all alive. The senior SEAL pointed toward the picture. Every man in that photo made it home. Silence. Because of her. Nobody laughed now. Nobody smirked. Nobody questioned who let the nurse into surgery. Because suddenly everyone understood. The real question wasn't who let her in. The real question was how lucky they were to have her there. Then the senior operator turned towards Sarah and said something that made the entire room emotional. "We never got to properly thank you." Sarah immediately shook her head. "You already did." The operator smiled. "No." Long pause. "We survived." Another pause. "That's different." For the first time all day, Sarah looked like she might cry. For a moment, nobody spoke. The ICU felt different now, not because of the story, because of what the story revealed. For weeks, people had judged Sarah based on a job title, a uniform, a first impression, and every single one of them had been wrong, especially Dr. Reynolds. The surgeon stared at the photograph in his hands, then at Sarah, then back at the photograph. The woman standing in front of him looked nothing like the image, not because she had changed, because the picture showed something everyone had missed. A strength, quiet strength, the kind that didn't announce itself, the kind that didn't need applause, the kind that simply showed up when people needed it most. Dr. Reynolds slowly walked toward her. The entire ICU watched. Nobody knew what he was going to say. Finally, he stopped in front of Sarah, then did something nobody expected. He apologized, publicly. "I owe you an apology." The room fell silent. Sarah looked surprised. "Doctor..." "No." He shook his head. "I wasn't listening." Silence. "I wasn't paying attention." Another pause. "And I treated you with less respect than you deserved." Nobody had ever heard Dr. Reynolds speak like that. Ever. The surgeon looked down briefly, then back up. "When you warned me during that surgery," he sighed, "you were right." The room remained quiet. "And instead of listening, I laughed." Sarah smiled gently. "It worked out." Dr. Reynolds shook his head. "That's not the point." Long pause. "The point is that I should have listened." The surgeon extended his hand. Sarah looked at it, then shook it. The ICU staff began clapping, softly at first, then louder. Not because of the apology, because they knew how difficult it was for Dr. Reynolds to admit he was wrong. The senior SEAL smiled. "Now that's leadership." Several operators nodded. The tension finally disappeared. People relaxed. Conversations resumed. The room felt lighter. Then something unexpected happened. One of the wounded operators motioned Sarah closer. She walked over. "What is it?" The SEAL smiled. "Look outside." Sarah turned toward the ICU windows and froze. The hospital parking lot was filling up. Fast, more vehicles, more veterans, more operators, more military personnel. Word had spread. People who had served with Sarah, people she'd trained, people she'd helped, people whose lives she had impacted. They were arriving from all over. A young nurse beside her whispered, "How many people know you?" Sarah laughed softly. "I honestly don't know." By evening, the hospital lobby was full. Not with reporters, not with politicians, not with celebrities, with grateful people. One man walked in with a prosthetic leg. Another carried scars across half his face. Another arrived with his wife and children. Each one had the same message. "Thank you." A former operator approached Sarah carrying a small box. "What is this?" The man smiled. "Open it." Inside sat a challenge coin unlike any she'd ever received. Engraved on one side were the names of dozens of operators. On the other side was a simple inscription, "For the one who always came back for us." Sarah stared at it silently. For the first time all day, a tear rolled down her cheek. Years later, new nurses at St. Gabriel still heard stories about Sarah Mitchell, the quiet ICU nurse, the woman who never talked about herself, the nurse who always caught problems before anyone else, the nurse who treated every patient exactly the same, whether they were homeless or generals, whether they were civilians or SEALs. One framed photograph eventually appeared in the hospital hallway. Not from a battlefield, not from military service. It showed Sarah standing in the ICU, surrounded by recovering patients, smiling, doing what she loved most, helping people heal. Beneath the photo sat a plaque. It read, "Titles tell you what someone does. Character tells you who they are." And every doctor, nurse, and patient who passed by it learned the same lesson. Never underestimate the quiet person in the room. Because sometimes, the nurse everyone laughs at is the bravest person they've ever met.